The problem with being an Omega in the Moonfang Pack's royal palace wasn't the work, which was honest, or the Alphas, who were mostly professional. The problem was the sheer, overwhelming, high-stakes invisibility. Clara Moon, polishing the same silver chalice for the third time, knew this with the certainty of a baker knowing dough has overproofed. She was a ghost in a maid's uniform, a necessary but unremarked part of the machinery. Her core wound, a quiet, persistent hum of inadequacy, told her this was her proper place. Don't be seen, don't be heard, and for the love of the moon, don't mess up. Tonight, messing up was not an option. Princess Valdis of the Stonepaw clan was arriving. A political alliance was on the line, one that hinged on a successful dinner, polite conversation, and, if the frantic whispers from the council chambers were to be believed, a subtle nudge of magical persuasion. Clara's job was simple. Carry the tray of welcome drinks, serve the princess and King Felix first, then melt back into the tapestries. She had practiced the route from the kitchens to the Great Hall 17 times. She had timed it. She had accounted for potential steam venting from the castle's ancient hot spring plumbing, a frequent and foggy menace. She had mapped the 3 most likely glimmermite flight paths based on which chandeliers had been freshly polished. She had, in the privacy of her own head, calculated the probability of each possible disaster and ranked them in order of public humiliation, from mild, a wobble, to catastrophic, total tray loss in front of foreign royalty. The probability of catastrophic failure was, by her own generous estimate, 4.7%. She had over-prepared, because over-preparation was the only defense she had against the universe's cruel sense of humor. Her best friend Lena tied the crisp ribbons of Clara's apron, her fingers nimble. "You look like you're about to serve drinks at an execution." "It feels like one," Clara muttered, adjusting the tray. The 2 goblets for the royals were heavier, solid gold inlaid with moonstones. The one on the right, for the princess, seemed to shimmer with a faint, rosy iridescence that wasn't just the light. Lord Graves was very specific. Right goblet for the princess, left for the king. Do not mix them up. "Graves is a fossil who thinks charm is a communicable disease," Lena said, plucking a stray thread from Clara's shoulder. "Just smile, don't trip, and think about the leftover cake in the pantry. Marcus Thorne said the king barely touched the honey lavender loaf I sent up." Clara's heart did a little flutter at the mention of the king's beta, not for herself, but for Lena, whose crush on the perpetually exhausted man was the palace's worst kept secret. Did he say anything else? He said the Glimmermites have eaten the polish off the king's ceremonial shield again, and the king spent 10 minutes having a silent, one-sided argument with it. Lena patted Clara's arm. "You'll be fine. You're invisible, remember? It's your superpower." It felt more like a curse. Armed with her tray and a stomach full of nervous butterflies, which she had mentally catalogued as anxiety butterflies, standard, dread butterflies, larger, slower wingbeat, and one lone doom moth, Clara made her way towards the Great Hall. The murmur of the assembled court grew louder, a sea of alphas in their finest silks and velvets. She spotted King Felix Severin standing by the hearth, looking every bit the ruler he was, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled just slightly at his collar. He wasn't brooding, like so many alphas of his station. He just looked tired. A king with the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders, and, apparently, a glimmermite infestation on his mind. He was laughing at something his beta, Marcus, had said, and the sight of it, a genuine, unguarded smile, was so startlingly handsome it made Clara's breath catch. She immediately looked down at her tray. Inadequate, invisible, just a maid. The mantra was a shield. Also, staring at the king while carrying heavy golden goblets was exactly the kind of variable she had not stress-tested in her 17 practice runs, and she was not about to introduce it now. She entered the hall. The lords and ladies parted for her, not out of courtesy, but the way you'd step around a piece of furniture. It was fine. It was normal. She reached the royal dais just as Princess Valdis, a formidable alpha woman with a warrior's build and eyes that missed nothing, was making her formal greetings. "Your Majesty," Clara said, her voice a practiced whisper. She curtsied, holding the tray steady. King Felix turned, his smile fading into a polite, kingly mask. His eyes, a startling shade of amber, flickered over her without really seeing her. "Thank you." He reached for his goblet. Princess Valdis reached for hers. This was it. The moment. Simple. She had practiced. And that's when a glimmermite, drawn by the dazzling polish on her tray, chose to fly directly into her left nostril. It was a tickle, then a spark, then an explosive, full-body sneeze that she had no time to stifle. Her eyes slammed shut. The world became a blur of motion and sound. The tray tilted violently. She heard the two heavy goblets leave the surface, heard the collective gasp of the court, and then felt warm liquid cascade over her head, drenching her hair, running down her face, soaking the front of her uniform. Something electric spread across her skin where the liquid touched, a buzzing that started at her scalp and raced downward. For a disorienting moment, the hall seemed to tilt sideways. The sounds around her muffled as if she were underwater. A warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature bloomed in her chest and expanded outward. She opened her eyes. The first thing she saw, the only thing she saw, was King Felix. He was staring at her, his mouth slightly agape, his amber eyes wide with shock. The clatter of golden goblets hitting the stone floor was somewhere very far away. And then it happened. It wasn't a thought, it was a chemical reaction. It was a tectonic shift in the bedrock of her soul. The quiet hum of inadequacy in her chest didn't just stop. It was replaced by a roaring, deafening orchestra. The man standing before her was not a king. He was the sunrise. He was the reason poems were written. His eyes were not amber. They were twin pools of liquid starlight, and she was drowning in them. Her heart, which moments ago had been trying to beat its way out of her ribs in terror, was now performing a triumphant ballad, complete with a string section and a choir of angels. Every fiber of her being, every cell, every atom screamed one singular, universe-altering truth. Mine. She was still on her knees, sopping wet, in front of the entire court, but inside she was soaring. She smiled, a slow, dazzling, beatific smile that had never been on her face before. King Felix took a half-step back. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice strained. Clara Moon, formerly an invisible maid, looked up at the man who was her destiny, and spoke the first words that came to her potion-addled mind. "My king," she breathed, her voice filled with an unholy amount of reverence. "Your face is mathematically perfect." From somewhere behind the king, Beta Marcus Thorne made a sound like a choking goose. The silence that followed was even louder than the first one. Clara didn't notice. She was too busy memorizing the exact geometric proportions of her soulmate's jawline. Her life's work, she realized, had just begun. The immediate aftermath was chaos, but a strangely muffled kind. Clara was aware of hands helping her up, of Lena's panicked face swimming in and out of focus, of Lord Graves's expression, which had curdled into a mask of pure fury. But it was all background noise. The main event, the only event, was Felix. He was still there, standing frozen, looking at her as if she were a complex puzzle he had no hope of solving. "His wolf is confused," a dry, monotone voice observed inside Felix's head. "The subject is an omega, a maid. She smells of floor polish, yeast, and now illegal enchantment. This is a severe breach of mating protocol. I will be logging a formal complaint with the moon goddess." Felix ignored the internal monologue. He had more pressing concerns. "Take her to the infirmary," he commanded, his voice tight. He forced himself to look away from Clara's unnervingly intense stare. It felt like trying to unstick two powerful magnets. Lena, bless her, practically dragged Clara from the hall. Clara went, but she walked backwards, her eyes fixed on Felix the entire way, a look of profound, tragic longing on her face, as if she were being exiled to a barren land instead of being led 50 feet down a corridor. "Well," Princess Valdis said, breaking the stunned silence. She was examining one of the dented goblets with a critical eye. That was more entertaining than most state dinners. Is this sort of thing common here? No, Felix said through gritted teeth. It is not. He met Lord Graves' gaze across the dais. The old wolf's face was impassive, but his eyes were cold with rage. The plan had not just failed, it had backfired spectacularly. The next few hours were a blur of apologies, diplomatic smoothing over, and quiet, menacing promises. Felix managed to salvage the evening with Princess Valdis, who, to her credit, seemed more amused than offended. She was a practical alpha. She understood political maneuvering, even when it involved clumsy maids and misfired love potions. Just see that the girl is taken care of, she'd said before retiring. It's not her fault she was used as a pawn. And for what it's worth, your Lord Graves looks like he's about to chew through stone. I'd watch him. Felix didn't need the warning. As soon as the princess was gone, he summoned Graves and the 2 other council members involved to his private study. The room was tense enough to spark. Explain, Felix said, his voice dangerously quiet. Graves did not flinch. Your Majesty, we acted in the best interests of the pack. An alliance with the Stonepaw is vital. Your reluctance to secure a mate bond, my reluctance to be drugged and forcibly bonded to a woman against my will and hers, you mean? Felix snapped. This was treason. Technically, it is high treason and a flagrant violation of Interpack Accord, Section 4, Subsection B, Magical Coercion in Mating Rituals, his wolf supplied helpfully. The penalty is forfeiture of lands and titles. I have already drafted the paperwork. It was a carefully calibrated overture, Graves insisted, his arrogance breathtaking. Both goblets carried a mild variant. Yours would have created a warmth, an openness, a nudge to see the princess in a favorable light. Hers, the same. Together they would have produced a convincing mutual spark, enough to begin a courtship from a place of genuine goodwill. The assumption was that over time, nature would take its course. A spark becomes a flame becomes a bond. It has worked before, in other packs, with far less compatible partners. Felix's blood ran cold. Where did you get a potion like this? Heartroot extract is banned under every interpack treaty on the continent. You couldn't have sourced it from any alchemist in the Moonfang territories without my intelligence network flagging it. A silence fell. Graves's jaw tightened, the first crack in his composure. He said nothing. He didn't source it, Marcus said quietly from the corner. He was holding a folded letter, its seal broken. I found this in the vault beneath Graves's study. It's written in Stonepaw diplomatic cipher, but I had Elias's apprentice decode it. He looked at Felix. It's from Chief Harkin, the princess's father. The room went very still. Chief Harkin wanted his daughter to become the Luna of the Moonfang pack, Marcus continued, reading from the decoded letter. He procured the heartroot extract himself from a source across the Eastern Sea. Rare, expensive, very illegal. He sent it to Graves 6 months ago with detailed instructions on dosage and delivery. Felix turned back to Graves, and his voice was barely a whisper. You conspired with a foreign head of state to drug me and his own daughter? Both of us? Without our knowledge or consent? Graves lifted his chin. Chief Harkin and I agreed that the alliance was too important to leave to the vagaries of personal chemistry. The doses were mild. A nudge, not a compulsion. The princess would have felt a warmth toward you, and you toward her. Over weeks, months, that warmth would have become real. No one would have been harmed. Except the princess's autonomy, Felix said. And mine. And, as it turns out, my maid's entire mind. Instead, the stronger dose has drenched a completely innocent servant and made her intensely devoted, Marcus finished, rubbing his temples. We just got a report from the infirmary. She refused to let the healer examine her until he swore an oath of fealty to the king of her heart. Then she tried to weave him a crown out of bandages. Felix felt a migraine building behind his eyes. He sank into his chair. You said both doses were mild. Why is she acting like this? The royal healer, a wizened old wolf named Elias, who had been summoned to the meeting, cleared his throat. The doses were calibrated for ingestion, Your Majesty. A sip. Heartroot extract is absorbed through any mucous membrane or prolonged skin contact. Being doused in a full goblet's worth is not the same as drinking a sip. It is the difference between holding a match and being thrown into a furnace. He said this with the quiet horror of a man who wished the science were less conclusive. She received a massive overdose. The potion has created a magical scaffold in her mind, a false emotional architecture that mimics the obsession of a bond. It has latched onto you as the target because you were the first person she saw when it activated. It is ferociously powerful and notoriously difficult to dispel. So she's stuck like this? Felix asked, horrified. The image of Clara's beatific, adoring face flashed in his mind. It was both terrifying and, in a strange way, deeply sad. Not permanently, Elias said slowly. An obsession this strong, built on a magical scaffold, can't just be broken. It must be overwritten. The false emotional architecture needs to be replaced with a genuine one. The counterfeit bond must be crowded out by a real one. Felix stared at him. What are you saying? I'm saying, the healer said, looking grave, that for the potion's effects to fade, she must genuinely fall in love with you. And you, well, you must fall for her. The magic recognizes authenticity. When the real emotion is strong enough, it will render the magical counterfeit obsolete. The room was silent. Felix felt a wave of dizziness. And you should know, Elias continued, the scaffold responds to authenticity from both sides. If your feelings toward her are genuine, even briefly, even in a small way, it creates a window. The false bond loosens when the real thing pushes against it. You'll see it happen. Moments where she surfaces, becomes herself again. When that happens, it's because something real just passed between you. The stronger the genuine feeling, the longer the window. This is procedurally unsound, his wolf stated flatly. Courtship protocols require a minimum of 6 social outings, 1 shared hunt, and a formal declaration of intent to the Pack Council. This is starting with the conclusion and working backwards. It is an administrative nightmare. So I have to court a maid who has been magically compelled to adore me in the hopes that she will actually adore me, to cure her of the adoration? Felix summarized, his voice rising with each word. That is the most ridiculous, circular, nonsensical thing I have ever heard. It is the only way, Elias affirmed. And it must be genuine. The magic is old. It will know if you are merely going through the motions. You cannot fake it. Felix stood up and began to pace, his hands clenched. He was a king. He had trade disputes to settle, borders to patrol, and a glimmermite problem to solve. He did not have time to engage in a fraudulent, backward courtship with a staff member who was currently trying to build him a shrine out of medical supplies. He stopped and looked at Graves, his eyes cold. You will be confined to your quarters under guard, all of you. We will deal with your treason later. And you can explain to Chief Harkin why his clever little arrangement poisoned a maid instead of his daughter. Right now, I have to go prevent my newest, most fervent admirer from composing a sonnet about my boots. He strode out of the room, leaving his treacherous council members in stunned silence. Marcus hurried to catch up with him in the corridor. Felix, what are you going to do? I'm going to the infirmary, Felix said, his jaw tight. Apparently, I have a date. Correction, his wolf said. You have a rescue mission. The subject's dignity is the primary casualty. We must extract it. I have prepared a 3-point plan. Step 1, establish a safe perimeter. But he didn't go to the infirmary, not yet. He took the back stairs, the ones that led to the postern gate and the moonlit tree line beyond the north wall. He stripped off his tunic, folded it over a low branch, and shifted. The change rolled through him like a held breath finally released, bones reshaping, skin giving way to dark fur, the world snapping into sharper focus as his wolf senses took over. He hit the ground on 4 legs and ran. Not toward anything, just ran. The perimeter trail was 3 miles of packed earth through dense pine, and he tore through it at full sprint, his claws throwing up loam, his breath a steady bellows rhythm. 2 sentries in wolf form, patrolling the eastern fence, flattened their ears and pressed against the tree line as he passed, recognizing their alpha's scent and his mood. He did 3 laps. By the end of the 3rd, the killing rage had burned down to something colder and more useful. He shifted back at the postern gate, pulled on his tunic, and went to face his newest, most fervent admirer. Felix reached the infirmary door and hesitated. He could hear a soft, wavering voice from within, singing a tune that was vaguely familiar, but with entirely new and frankly alarming lyrics. Oh, his eyes are like the honey, his voice a rumbling storm. I'd trade all of my money just to keep his castle warm. Felix closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This was going to be a very, very long week. He pushed the door open. Clara was sitting on the edge of a cot, a half-finished bandage crown in her lap, her eyes shining with manic glee. The moment she saw him, she sprang to her feet. "My sun and stars!" she exclaimed, her voice ringing with sincerity. "You have come for me!" Felix Severin, king of the Moonfang pack, looked at the small, drenched Omega maid who was gazing at him as if he had personally hung the moon in the sky, and felt a profound sense of doom. His wolf, for the first time that night, was completely silent. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The imprisonment of Lord Graves and his co-conspirators sent a shockwave through the palace, but it was a ripple compared to the tsunami that was Clara Moon. Felix, after a deeply uncomfortable conversation in which he tried to explain the situation to a woman who kept interrupting to compliment his regal posture, had her moved from the infirmary to a suite of guest rooms. It was, he reasoned, the only way to keep her from serenading the entire household staff at 3 a.m. Strategic relocation is sound, his wolf noted, as Felix watched 2 guards carry Clara's meager belongings. Proximity will be required for the courtship. However, her current emotional state is a tactical liability. She has 0 situational awareness. That was an understatement. The first official day of their courtship began with a scream from the royal kitchens. Felix and Marcus arrived to find Clara, ankle-deep in flour, standing protectively in front of a mountain of collapsing dough. The head cook, a burly alpha named Greta, was staring at the 5-tiered monstrosity with horror. She called it a confection of eternal devotion, Greta whispered to Felix. She said it was a testament to the moment your souls touched. Then she tried to add a 7th layer, and the whole thing surrendered. Clara beamed at Felix, completely unfazed by the disaster. "It is a metaphor, my king. Our love is a towering achievement that cannot be contained by the mere laws of physics." She gestured expansively, sending a cloud of flour billowing into the air, which settled gently on Felix's dark tunic. He resisted the urge to wipe it off. "Clara," he said, his voice strained, "perhaps we could start with something smaller. A scone, maybe?" "A scone?" she repeated, looking wounded. "Is our love a scone, Your Majesty? Small, dry, best served with clotted cream?" "I like scones," Marcus offered weakly from the doorway. Clara ignored him. Her eyes, wide and earnest, were fixed on Felix. "No, our love is a banquet, a feast. I shall begin again." Felix managed to coax her out of the kitchen only by promising her a personal tour of the royal library. This, he thought, would be a safe, quiet activity. He was wrong. The library was Felix's sanctuary, a vast, silent space filled with the scent of old paper and leather. He had spent his lonely childhood here, losing himself in stories of other worlds. He hoped the quiet would have a calming effect on Clara. Instead, she saw it as a landscape of romantic possibility. She didn't walk between the shelves. She glided, running a hand reverently over the spines of books. "So much knowledge," she whispered, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "But none of it can compare to the wisdom in your eyes." Felix, who had been about to show her a rare illustrated history of the pack, stopped. "My eyes?" "Yes," she said, turning to him. "I have composed a short verse, if you would allow it." Before he could politely decline, she cleared her throat and began to recite. "A king's gaze, a tome unbound, where secrets of the heart are found. No dusty page can hope to teach the lesson that your eyes beseech." She finished with a flourish, looking at him expectantly. "The meter is flawed, and beseech is a weak rhyme for teach," his wolf critiqued dispassionately. "However, the sentiment, while magically induced, is thematically appropriate for the location." Grade C+. "That's very thoughtful, Clara," Felix managed. He decided to change tactics. He needed to find the real Clara, the woman underneath the terrible poetry and grand declarations. Elias had said the cure was genuine emotion. How could he foster that if he didn't even know who she was? "Tell me about yourself," he said, pulling 2 chairs near a window overlooking the gardens. "Before all this, what do you enjoy?" Clara blinked, momentarily thrown. "Enjoy? My king, my only joy is you." "No, I mean before yesterday," he pressed gently. "You worked in the kitchens. Lena tells me you're a wonderful baker." This was part of the file Marcus had compiled for him. Clara Moon, 25, Omega, orphaned. Employed at Palace for 6 years. Specialty, grief cakes. Known for being quiet, diligent, and terrified of glimmer mites. A flicker of something real crossed her face. A shadow of the anxious, invisible maid. I like the way bread dough feels in my hands," she said softly, her gaze dropping to her lap. "I like the smell of cinnamon. I like it when a cake rises perfectly." For a second, she was just Clara, a baker talking about her craft, a genuine window. Felix felt his curiosity sharpen, a real, unforced interest in the woman behind the enchantment. Clara seemed to settle more firmly into herself, the manic gleam dimming another degree, as if something in the air between them had shifted. "Grief cakes," he said. "Lena says they're legendary." Her head snapped up, the potion haze crashing back in with the force of a tidal wave. Her eyes lit up. "Grief cakes, for when one is grieving the sorrowful time before they met you. What a brilliant idea! I shall bake you 1,000 of them. A mountain of cakes to represent the mountain of my devotion." Felix sighed. 1 step forward, 3 giant cake-themed steps back. But Elias's words echoed in his head. The window had opened because his curiosity was real. It had closed because the feeling wasn't strong enough yet. The B-plot, meanwhile, was progressing at a much more sedate pace. That evening, Marcus Thorne found Lena polishing silver in a quiet alcove, vigorously scrubbing away a fresh glimmermite smear. "Evening," he said, leaning against the wall. He looked even more tired than usual. "Beta," Lena said, not looking up. "Come to report on the latest romantic catastrophe?" She tried to re-choreograph the changing of the guard into a ballet representing the seasons of her love, Marcus said, his voice flat. The guards were not amused. The captain threatened to abdicate. Lena finally stopped scrubbing and looked at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "And you, Marcus? How are you holding up in all this?" "I'm considering retiring to a remote monastery, one without kings or love potions." He watched her hands, strong and capable, as she worked. "You're worried about her." "Of course I am," Lena said, her voice softening. "This isn't her. She's quiet and shy, and she thinks her biggest ambition in life is to create a perfectly laminated croissant. Now she's this. What happens when the potion wears off? The fall is going to be brutal." "Felix will catch her," Marcus said, with a certainty that surprised even himself. He's a good man, under all the kingliness. And who catches you, Beta Thorn? Lena asked softly, her eyes meeting his. Marcus, for the first time all day, looked flustered. He straightened up. The Glimmermite situation on the West Wing requires my immediate attention. He practically fled, but not before Lena saw the faint blush on his cheeks. Back in the guest suite, Felix was attempting another genuine connection activity. He was reading to Clara from one of his favorite books, a simple adventure story about a boy and his wolf. He'd hoped the story would be a neutral ground. Clara was listening, but not to the words. She was perched on the edge of her seat, her chin propped in her hands, staring at his mouth as he read. The boy looked at his wolf, and he knew he was not alone in the great dark wood. Felix read, his voice steady. The cadence of your speech is like a river, Clara whispered dreamily, flowing ever onward to the great sea of my affection. Felix stopped reading. He closed the book with a quiet thud. Clara, are you listening to the story at all? The story of us is the only one that matters, she said. He ran a hand through his hair, dislodging the last of the flower. This was impossible. He was trying to connect with a person whose entire personality had been hijacked by a magical broadcast signal tuned to a single station. Him. He felt a pang of guilt. It was his council's fault, but he was the king. He was responsible for her, and he was failing miserably. The subject is not receptive to literary analysis, his wolf observed. Suggest alternative strategy. Shared activity. Nonverbal. Proximity without expectation of coherent dialogue. Felix looked at Clara, at her wide, adoring, completely un-Clara-like eyes. He thought of the flicker of the real person he'd seen when she talked about baking. He had to get back to that. Tomorrow, he said, standing up, we're going to the gardens. And we're not going to talk about my eyes, or my voice, or the sea of your affection. We are going to look at flowers. That's it. Can you do that? Clara's face fell for a moment, as if he'd asked her to perform a great sacrifice. Then it brightened again. Of course, my love. I shall gaze upon the petunias and see your strength. I shall look at the roses and see your passion. I shall observe the humble daisies and see your— Just look at the flowers, Clara, Felix interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. Just the flowers. He left her suite feeling utterly defeated. He was no closer to curing her than he had been yesterday. He was simply the warden of a very enthusiastic, poetry-reciting prisoner. As he walked down the corridor, he passed a tapestry depicting the pack's founding. It was slightly crooked. He reached out, his hand hovering over the edge to straighten it. It was a nervous habit, a small act of control in a life where so much was out of his hands. He straightened it perfectly, then continued on his way, the weight of his kingdom, and Clara Moon, settling even more heavily on his shoulders. The days that followed fell into a strange, exhausting rhythm. Every dawn, before the rest of the palace stirred, the pack ran. It was tradition older than the castle itself, the morning run, and Felix led it in wolf form, his dark wolf breaking the tree line first, 30 or 40 wolves streaming behind him through the silver-gray forest, paws silent on the pine needle floor. Clara watched from her guest suite window on the third morning, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. Below, the courtyard emptied as wolves poured from every door, guards and servants and nobles alike, all rank stripped away in fur. Felix's wolf was easy to spot, larger than the others, dark-coated, running at the front with a long, tireless stride. The pack fanned out behind him like a living river. They're beautiful, she whispered, and for once, it was not the potion talking. It was just a baker who had spent 6 years in the kitchens and never once watched the morning run. By the time Felix returned, shifted back, and appeared at her door with damp hair and the sharp, clean scent of pine still on his skin, she had composed a 14-verse epic about his wolf's majestic haunches. The lucid moment had not survived. Felix would attempt a normal human interaction with Clara. Clara, in turn, would interpret that interaction through the funhouse mirror of her magical obsession, turning it into an epic romance of world-shattering proportions. It was like trying to have a quiet cup of tea with a hurricane. The walk in the garden was a prime example. Felix had hoped for quiet contemplation. He got a running commentary. "Oh, look, a bee!" Clara had exclaimed, pointing. "It flies from flower to flower seeking nectar, just as my soul flies to you, its one true source of sweetness." Felix had just stared at the bee, which, for its part, seemed entirely unimpressed. The attempt at a shared meal in a private dining room resulted in Clara trying to cut his food for him, insisting that his hands were too noble for such menial tasks. He'd spent 20 minutes in a polite but firm standoff over a piece of roasted chicken. His wolf was a constant, deadpan presence in his mind. The subject has now compared your eyes to twin suns, pools of amber, silent stars, and, most recently, well-polished boots. The metaphor is degrading in quality. This may indicate a fluctuation in the enchantment's power. Felix clung to that thought like a lifeline. Fluctuations were good. Fluctuations meant the magic wasn't absolute. It meant there were cracks where the real Clara might peek through. He saw another one of those cracks during a disastrous attempt at art appreciation in the castle's gallery. Clara had been gazing at a portrait of Felix's grim-faced great-grandfather, Horath the Harsh. "Such a strong jaw," she'd sighed dreamily. "It is the jawline of your noble lineage, a dynasty of perfection." "He was famous for levying a tax on beards," Felix had replied dryly, "and for losing a border dispute over a misunderstanding about a goat. He wasn't perfect." Clara had turned to him, a brief, genuine frown creasing her brow. "No one is perfect." The words were simple, unadorned. For a heartbeat, the manic gleam in her eyes vanished, replaced by a quiet, weary clarity. She looked like herself. Then, as quickly as it came, it was gone. "Except for you, of course," she'd chirped, the potion reasserting its dominance. "You are the culmination of all their flawed attempts at greatness." But Felix had seen it. The real Clara was in there, fighting. He just had to give her more to hold on to. That evening, he dismissed her ladies-in-waiting, a new and unwelcome addition to palace life, assigned to keep Clara from, for example, trying to replace the royal standard with a banner embroidered with a giant heart, and found her sitting by the window in her suite. "No poetry tonight?" he asked, keeping his tone light. She looked up, startled. "I was just thinking." "About what?" He sat in the chair opposite her, maintaining a careful distance. "About how high up we are," she said, her voice small. It was the most normal thing she had said to him in days. "I used to share a room in the servants' wing. It faced a wall." "The view is better from up here," he agreed, following her gaze out over the moonlit castle town. They sat in silence for a moment. It wasn't the charged, expectant silence that usually followed one of her declarations. It was a comfortable, quiet space. "Atmospheric conditions are favorable for genuine emotional exchange," his wolf noted. "Recommend proceeding with topic, shared vulnerability." Felix took a breath. "You know," he said, his voice softer than he intended, "sometimes I feel like I'm in a room facing a wall, too." Clara turned from the window, her expression curious. The manic energy was gone, replaced by a quiet attentiveness. "But you're the king. You have all the views." "I have the crown," he corrected gently. "And sometimes it feels less like a crown and more like a helmet I can't take off. Everyone sees it, but no one sees the man wearing it. They see a symbol, a legacy. My father was a great king, a legend. And most days, I feel like a placeholder. Just keeping his throne warm until someone better comes along." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. He hadn't meant to say it, but the words had come tumbling out, drawn by the rare moment of peace. He expected a grand, poetic response about how he was the greatest king who ever lived. Instead, Clara's expression softened with a kind of sad understanding that had nothing to do with the potion. "A placeholder," she repeated softly. She looked down at her hands, the hands of a maid, a baker. "I know what that feels like. Like you're just filling a space until your part is over." It was her. It was really her. The words were quiet, born of her own inadequacy, her own core wound, and in that moment, their two wounds rhymed perfectly. He wasn't a king, and she wasn't a maid. They were just two people who felt like imposters in their own lives. The connection was a fragile, shimmering thread in the air between them, real. He held his breath, terrified of breaking the spell. The real spell, not the potion. Clara looked up, her eyes clear and deep. "Felix," she said, and the way she said his name, without a title, without the breathless adoration, made his heart skip a beat. And then she blinked twice. A violent shudder went through her, and the potion came roaring back. "A placeholder for greatness," she declared, her voice suddenly booming. She shot to her feet. "You are not a placeholder. You are the destination, the very pinnacle of kingliness. Your father was but the prologue to your magnificent story." Felix's shoulders slumped. The moment was gone, shattered. He had been so close. "I have to go," he said, standing abruptly. The disappointment was a sharp physical ache. "I have council matters." "Of course, my lion-hearted leader," she said, striking a dramatic pose. "Go and be magnificent. I shall wait for you, your ever-faithful moon to your glorious sun." He practically fled the room. The whiplash was making him dizzy. But as he walked down the hall, he wasn't just frustrated. He was something else, too. He was hopeful. Because for 30 seconds, he hadn't been trying to cure Clara Moon. He had been talking to her, and he had liked it, more than he cared to admit. The next day brought a new and deeply unwelcome development. Clara discovered competition. Felix was in a tedious trade negotiation with two envoys from the Silver Creek Pack, a famously dour and pragmatic people. They were haggling over lumber tariffs, and Felix's head was pounding. Suddenly, the doors to the negotiation chamber burst open. Clara stood there, her hands on her hips, her eyes blazing. She was not looking at Felix. She was glaring at the younger of the two envoys, a handsome, silver-haired alpha who had, 5 minutes earlier, paid Felix a standard, formal compliment on his fair-mindedness. "I heard you," Clara announced, her voice ringing with accusation. "I heard you complimenting his fair-mindedness. That is my domain." The entire room froze. The two envoys stared at her. "I am the official and sole provider of compliments for His Majesty King Felix Severin," Clara continued, advancing into the room. "Your flattery, while likely sincere, is an encroachment on my duties. I must ask you to cease and desist." The silver-haired envoy looked at Felix, his eyebrows raised to his hairline. "Is this a local custom?" "She is attempting to establish territorial dominance over praise," Felix's wolf observed. "This is not a recognized courtship ritual. It is, however, bold. I am making a note." "Clara," Felix said through gritted teeth, "we are in the middle of a very important—" "What is more important than defending the sanctity of your compliments?" she demanded. "This morning, I composed an 11-stanza ode to your judicious nature. It is currently under review by the royal scribe for punctuation. And this upstart thinks he can just walk in here with a casual, 'Oh, you're so fair-minded,' and steal my thunder? I think not." Marcus, who had been standing by the door, put his face in his hands. Felix felt a hysterical laugh bubbling in his chest. This was his life now, international diplomacy being derailed by poetic jealousy. He took a deep breath. "Clara, the envoy was simply being polite." "Politeness is the currency of strangers," she declared. "Devotion is the currency of the heart. My currency, not his." She pointed an accusing finger at the baffled envoy. Somehow, Felix managed to smooth things over. He promised the Silver Creek envoys a concession on the tariffs, which Marcus would later describe, with the quiet fury of a man who had spent 3 weeks negotiating, as expensive, and had Clara escorted from the room, still muttering about copyright infringement on compliments. The incident, however, served as a turning point. The potion wasn't just making her adoring, it was making her possessive. And that was dangerous. The volatility came to a head during the monthly ritual of sincere grumbling. It was a stupid, ancient tradition, but it kept the peace. Pack members would write their petty grievances on scrolls and tie them to a gnarled old oak tree in the castle courtyard, the grumble post. The scrolls were anonymous and would be burned, unread, by the king at sunset. Felix was presiding over the ritual, a tedious but necessary part of his duties. He watched as servants, guards, and nobles alike tied their complaints to the branches. He saw Lena tie a scroll, and he had a feeling it mentioned a certain Beta who was emotionally constipated. Then he saw Clara. She wasn't tying a scroll, she was marching towards the tree with a look of grim determination, carrying a small, beautifully decorated box. She ignored the line, walked straight to the tree, and stood before it. "I have a grievance," she announced. The crowd quieted, turning to stare. This was not how the ritual worked. It was anonymous, silent. "My grievance is with this entire ritual," she declared. "Why should our glorious king, a shining beacon of perfection, be subjected to our petty complaints? He has no flaws. To grumble in his kingdom is to grumble about the sun for being too bright." A low murmur went through the crowd. This was bordering on sacrilege. The right to grumble was sacred. "Therefore," Clara continued, opening her box, "I have not brought a complaint. I have brought antidotes." She began taking out small, exquisitely decorated cookies. Counter-grumble cookies. For every complaint, a cookie of praise. For every sour word, a sweet morsel of truth about our king's boundless magnificence. She began trying to force cookies on the bewildered pack members. "You, grumbling about the leaky roof in the East Barracks? Have a cookie celebrating the king's strong and sheltering leadership. You, complaining about the Glimmermites? Have a cookie in honor of his dazzling personality, which attracts all beautiful things." It was a disaster. It was turning a solemn pack ritual into a bizarre, one-woman propaganda campaign. Felix knew he had to intervene. He strode down from the dais and gently took Clara's arm. "Clara, that's enough." She looked at him, her eyes shining with righteous fervor. "But they need to know the truth." "They need to grumble," Felix said firmly. "It's their right, a right I protect." He looked out at his pack, at their confused, annoyed faces. "Even when the grumbles are about me." He led her away from the tree, the box of cookies still clutched in her hand. Later that night, the magical fluctuations became more severe, but they were different now. He found her in the library again, but this time she wasn't composing poetry. She was huddled in a chair, wrapped in a blanket, looking small and lost. The manic energy was gone, replaced by a deep, shuddering terror. And she was holding one of her own counter-grumble cookies, turning it over in her hands, staring at it as if it were evidence at a crime scene. "I decorated these with royal icing," she said, her voice hollow. "I piped tiny crowns on them. 47 cookies, each one with a tiny crown. Clara, do you know how long it takes to pipe 47 tiny crowns?" she asked, and her voice cracked. "I am a trained baker. I used that training to make propaganda cookies." Felix's heart ached for her. He knelt in front of her chair, his movements slow and careful. "It's not your fault, Clara." "I called a visiting diplomat an upstart," she said, ticking off fingers. "I tried to choreograph a ballet. I wrote a poem about your boots. I disrupted a sacred ritual with," she looked down at the cookie, "baked goods of aggressive positivity." The horror in her voice was absolute, but there was something else there too. a grim, exhausted absurdity. She was seeing the comedy of it, even as it crushed her.
It was a very descriptive poem, he offered, trying for a weak smile.
And the cookies were, technically, excellent. A sound escaped her that was half laugh, half sob. Oh, wonderful. I'll put that on my headstone. Clara Moon, technically excellent at humiliating herself. This was different from the window scene. She was more here, more herself, and more dangerous to be around. Because the real Clara, the one with the dark, self-aware humor, was someone he actively wanted to talk to, not just someone he was trying to reach. He had shifted earlier that evening without thinking about it, padding into the library in wolf form and settling on the rug in front of the fire while she read. His wolf was quieter in this shape, the internal monologue reduced to sensation rather than commentary, and something about his presence as a wolf seemed to calm her, too. She had read aloud for almost an hour, her voice steady and clear, one hand absently dropping to scratch behind his ear.
Then she had frozen, her fingers still buried in his fur, the realization hitting her like a brick.
"I just scratched the king behind the ear," she said, her voice hollow. "Like a dog." He had shifted back, sitting cross-legged on the rug, his hair disheveled from the change, and said, "It was the left ear. The left ear is the good one." She had stared at him for 3 full seconds before the laugh escaped, startled and genuine, and the lucid window held. "You know what the worst part is?" she said quietly, and she looked at him with eyes that were almost entirely clear. "It keeps coming and going. One minute I feel normal, and the next this wave just washes me away. And I can feel it coming and I can't stop it. I'm standing there watching myself compose odes, and I'm screaming inside and nothing comes out except more terrible poetry." "You're fighting it," he said. "That's not nothing." "I'm losing," she whispered. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently touched her shoulder. "You're not an embarrassment, Clara. You're brave." She stared at him, her tears suspended. "Brave? You're trapped in a storm that isn't yours, and you're still fighting to find your way out. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen." She didn't lean into his touch this time. Instead, she went very still, looking at his hand on her shoulder and then at his face, studying him with an intensity that had nothing to do with the potion. It was careful, wary, the look of someone who was starting to feel something real and was terrified of it. "You should go," she said, her voice barely audible. "Are you sure?" "Yes." She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, a deliberate withdrawal. "I think I need the wave to not come back right now. And when you're here, it's—" She trailed off, her jaw tightening. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. She was protecting the lucid moment by sending him away. It was the most deliberate, most rational thing she had done since the potion hit her. Felix felt a pang of loss, but underneath it, a fierce respect. She was making a choice, a small one, but hers. "Okay," he said quietly, and stood. He was at the door when her voice followed him, barely a whisper. "Felix? The cookies really were technically excellent." He smiled into the dark corridor. The incident, however, had an unintended consequence. It gave Lord Graves, stewing under house arrest, an idea. He had few comforts in his confinement, but he still had a valet. The old man had served the Graves household for 40 years, and the guards saw no reason to deny a prisoner his clean shirts. The notes were folded into the laundry. Graves had heard, through this channel, about the king's strange, gentle courtship of the Omega maid. He'd heard about her moments of lucidity, growing longer each day. He saw the king's growing affection not as a cure, but as a weakness. His new plan was simple and cruel. If the king was protecting her, Graves would prove she was not worth protecting. He would expose her, not as an enchanted innocent, but as an unstable, grasping social climber, a madwoman unfit to be near the king. He would use the potion's chaos to break Felix's resolve. He sent a message to one of his remaining loyalists on the council, a sour-faced alpha named Lord Boren. The stage was set for the formal announcement of the renewed and heavily discounted trade agreement with the Silver Creek Pack, the very pack whose envoy Clara had accosted. It was a public event, with the entire court in attendance. It was the perfect venue for a public humiliation. Felix, blissfully unaware, felt a cautious optimism. Clara's lucid periods were growing longer, and, he had noticed, with a warmth that was becoming harder to explain away as duty, they seemed to last longest when he forgot he was trying to cure her and just talk to her. She was sharp, observant. She'd noticed that the glimmer mites swarmed in predictable patterns based on which surfaces had been freshly polished, and had quietly suggested to Greta that the kitchen's copper pots be cleaned with matte finish oil instead of high-shine polish. The glimmermite population in the kitchens dropped by half within 2 days. She had solved, through sheer practical intelligence, a problem the palace had been throwing exterminators at for decades. She'd also, during one of her longer lucid stretches, mentioned something that stuck with him. She'd been examining the residue that the potion had left on her dress. She'd kept the dress, because it was evidence, and because, she said darkly, I want to remember what happened to me so I never let anyone do it again. It smells like dawn bloom, she'd said, frowning, holding the fabric to her nose with the critical focus of a baker evaluating ingredients. And something else, something I recognized from the kitchens. Siren song extract. We use a diluted version in bridal cakes. It enhances emotional receptivity. But whoever made this used the undiluted form, which is... She had trailed off, looking slightly green. Well, it's like the difference between a glass of wine and a bottle of spirits. You can identify the ingredients by smell? Felix had asked, surprised. She'd given him a look that was pure, unenchanted Clara, a flicker of dry pride. I'm a baker. I can tell you the hydration percentage of a dough by squeezing it. Identifying aromatic compounds is just Tuesday. It was a small moment, but Felix carried it with him. She wasn't just a victim of the potion. She understood it. She could read it. He found her in the gardens before the Silver Creek ceremony, nervously fidgeting with the ribbons on her new dress, a simple but elegant gown he'd had made for her. Nervous? He asked gently. Terrified, she admitted, her voice a whisper. What if I say something about someone's jawline again? He couldn't help but smile. Then I'll declare it a new mandatory courtly greeting. Jawline compliments for everyone. She looked up at him, and for a moment, her own smile was genuine, untainted by magic. You're being very kind about all this. I'm just glad to see you, Clara, he said, and was startled by the simple truth of the words. The real you. The moment was warm and real and full of promise. But as they entered the great hall, Felix felt a prickle of unease. Lord Boren was standing near the dais, a smug look on his face. Lord Graves was not present, but his influence felt like a cold draft in the room. The ceremony began. The Silver Creek envoy, looking deeply uncomfortable, was making his formal acceptance speech. Felix stood beside him, feigning rapt attention. Clara was standing with Lena near the edge of the crowd, looking pale but composed. It was then that Lord Boren made his move. He stepped forward, interrupting the envoy. Your Majesty, before we conclude, there is a matter of courtly decorum we must address. His voice was oily, but carried across the silent hall. He turned his gaze on Clara. We have among us a new presence. An Omega who has, through unusual circumstances, found herself in your favor. A murmur rippled through the court. Felix's blood ran cold. He knew, instantly, what was happening. While we all rejoice in the king's kindness, Boren continued, his lip curling, concerns have been raised about the stability and suitability of this individual. Her recent public displays have been erratic, disruptive, and frankly, alarming. He was playing to the crowd's existing prejudices, their whispers and their gossip. Clara shrank back, her face ashen. Lena put a protective arm around her. "Is this the new standard for our court?" Boren's voice rose, full of false indignation. "Are we now to be led by the whims of a bewitched, hysterical Omega? A servant who has clearly lost her mind and is taking advantage of the king's good nature?" The accusation hung in the air, vile and potent. Felix's wolf was a low, steady growl in the back of his mind, a pure, protective fury. He stepped forward, ready to end this. No. The voice was quiet, but it carried. It was Clara. She had stepped out from behind Lena. Her face was white, her hands were shaking, but her eyes were clear. Completely, terrifyingly clear. The lucid window blown wide open by a surge of something that was not the potion at all. "You're right," Clara said, and her voice did not waver. "My behavior has been erratic. It has been disruptive. It has been, by any reasonable standard, alarming." She took a breath. "I made propaganda cookies. I tried to knight a goose. I wrote an 11-stanza ode to a man's judicious nature and submitted it for peer review. I am aware." A stunned ripple went through the crowd. This was not the script Boren had expected. "But I did not choose this," Clara continued, and now there was iron underneath the tremor. "I was doing my job, carrying a tray, and your ally, Lord Graves, put a weapon in a goblet and it hit me instead of its target. I did not ask to be poisoned. I did not ask to lose my mind in front of everyone I have ever worked beside. And I did not ask for the king's attention." She looked at Felix then, briefly, and there was something raw and unprotected in her gaze. She looked away before he could respond. "So if you want to question someone's suitability, Lord Boren," she said, turning back to him, "I suggest you start with the man who thought drugging a foreign princess at a state dinner was good statecraft, not the maid who got caught in the crossfire." The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before. It was not stunned or amused or mortified. It was the silence of a room recalibrating. Felix walked forward, not to rescue her. She had already rescued herself. He walked to stand beside her because that was where he wanted to be. "Lord Boren is correct about one thing," Felix said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "Clara Moon's presence at my side is unusual." He gently took her hand. Her fingers were ice cold and trembling. He squeezed them. He didn't pull her forward. He stood with her, a united front. "It is unusual, because for the first time in a very long time, I have someone at my side who is not trying to use me, or flatter me, or gain power from me," he said. "She is here because she was the victim of a cowardly, treasonous plot. You just heard her describe, with more honesty and courage than anyone in this room has shown in years, exactly what that plot cost her." He looked down at Clara, his voice softening. She called it what it was, and she did it while still shaking. "That is not hysteria, Lord Boren. That is the bravest person in this hall." Then he looked back at the court, his mask of command gone, replaced by a raw, unshielded honesty. "You see a maid, an Omega, an inconvenience. I see a woman of strength and wit, who has endured something none of you could comprehend with more grace than any of you deserve. She is under my personal protection, not as your king, but as a man. An insult to her is an insult to me, and I do not forgive insults." The threat was unmistakable, but it was the combination, her fierce, trembling honesty followed by his fierce, deliberate sincerity, that gave it its power. Neither of them had hidden. They had both stood bare in front of the court and dared it to look away. Lord Boren paled, sputtering, but no words came out. The court was stunned into silence, not by a king's rage, but by something rarer. Two people who had both refused to be ashamed. Felix turned back to Clara. The potion was still there. He could see its shimmer in the depths of her eyes, but underneath it was something else. Something that had nothing to do with magic. She had defended herself, and he had defended her, and the combination had created something neither of them could have built alone. A foundation. real. The aftermath of that evening was profound.
Lord Boren was stripped of his council seat and exiled to a remote northern outpost, a punishment that was both swift and deeply satisfying to the palace gossip network. The court, having witnessed Clara speak for herself with shaking hands and an unshaking voice, suddenly found a new respect for her. They were still wary, but the mockery was replaced by a hesitant curiosity. More importantly, the potion's hold on Clara began to fray, rapidly. Her lucid moments stretched into hours. The frantic, poetic pronouncements dwindled, replaced by awkward, stammering conversations and long stretches of mortified normalcy. The whiplash was less violent now. The waves still came, but it was more of a swell than a tsunami. One moment she'd be discussing the weather, the next she'd clap a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with the horrified memory of trying to knight a goose she felt was looking at Felix disrespectfully.
"In my defense," she said of the goose incident during a lucid stretch that lasted most of an afternoon, "it was looking at you disrespectfully. It had very judgmental eyes." She paused. "I can't believe I just tried to defend the goose thing." Felix laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and Clara stared at him for a moment, her cheeks flushing, and then looked away quickly, fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. Not a potion reaction, something else, something quieter. Felix was patient through it all. He treated her not as a patient to be cured, but as a friend who was recovering from a long illness. They spent their time in quiet pursuits, reading in the library, where Clara now offered actual literary criticism instead of odes to his mouth, and had strong opinions about narrative structure that she delivered with a kind of fierce, surprised confidence, as if she hadn't known she was allowed to have opinions. Walking in the gardens, where she could identify different species of roses by scent alone, a skill she deployed with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had spent years training her nose. He even let her teach him how to properly knead bread in the royal kitchens, a chaotic but surprisingly fun afternoon that ended with them both covered in flour and laughing. "You're overworking the gluten," she told him, her hands guiding his on the dough. "Stop manhandling it. It's bread, not a hostile negotiation." "Everything in my life is a hostile negotiation," he said. "Then your bread is going to be terrible," she said, and the look she gave him, exasperated, amused, warm, hit him harder than any sonnet ever had. He was falling for her. Hard. He was falling for the quiet, anxious baker who chewed on her lip when she was concentrating, who categorized her own anxieties like a naturalist classifying butterflies, who could debate philosophy with him one minute and then trip over a completely flat surface the next. He loved the way she saw the world, the small details she noticed that everyone else missed. He was no longer trying to overwrite the potion. He was just getting to know Clara. And the more he knew, the more he wanted to. His wolf, for its part, had shifted its tone. The deadpan critiques were replaced by curt, approving statements. The subject scent is normalizing. Traces of illegal enchantment are at 12%. Traces of genuine affection are at 78%. The remaining 10% appears to be flour. But with Clara's growing clarity came a new and terrible problem: shame. The more she remembered, the more mortified she became. The grand gestures, the terrible poetry, the public declarations, they were a highlight reel of humiliation she couldn't escape. Her inadequacy wound, which Felix's defense had bandaged, which her own brave speech had stitched shut, was now festering underneath in a new way. Because now she was afraid, not of the potion, but of what she felt without it. The moments with Felix were real. She knew they were real. And that was worse, because real things could be lost, and she had spent her whole life losing. She started avoiding his eyes, her conversations growing shorter. The easy laughter between them was replaced by a tense, careful distance. She was pulling away, not because of magic, but because of choice. She was choosing safety over risk, invisibility over exposure. This was the dark moment, the point where the cure became its own kind of poison. It happened on a rainy afternoon,
3 weeks after the incident, they were in the library, a comfortable silence between them as they read in separate chairs. It was the most normal they had ever been. Clara set her book down with a soft thud. "It's gone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Felix looked up. "What is?" "The feeling," she said, her hands twisting in her lap. "The noise, the orchestra. It's quiet." She looked at him, and for the first time her eyes were completely, utterly clear. There was no potion, no shimmer, no trace of enchantment. Just Clara. And a deep, bottomless ocean of something far more complicated than mortification. Felix's heart should have soared. This was the goal. She was cured. But looking at her face, closed off, braced, as if preparing for a blow, all he felt was dread. "Clara," he started, but she cut him off. "I remember everything," she said, her voice flat and brittle. "Every single word. The sonnet about your boots, the confection of eternal devotion, the goose." She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I am so sorry." "You have nothing to be sorry for," he said, getting up and moving towards her. "It wasn't you." "But it was my mouth," she cried, shrinking away from him as he approached. "My body, and you had to endure it. All of it. The whole pack thinks I'm a lunatic. And you had to stand there and take it and pretend to be kind because you're the king and you felt responsible." Her words were a punch to the gut. "Pretend? Clara, that's not—" "I know what this looks like from the inside," she said, and her voice was quiet now, terribly quiet. "I'm a baker. I know what substitution looks like. You can make a cake with applesauce instead of eggs and it will hold together and it will taste fine and nobody will know the difference. But it's not the real thing. This," she gestured between them, "was built on a potion. The scaffolding is gone and now we're just standing in midair, hoping the floor is there." "Clara, the floor is there," he said, his voice cracking. "It's been there for weeks." But she was shaking her head, already standing, already retreating. "I have to go. I need to think. I can't do that here, where everything smells like you, and the library, and the stupid flower." She was halfway to the door. "I can't tell what's real if I'm standing this close to you." "Where will you go?" She paused at the door. "Lena's parents have a cottage outside the village. She offered it." She still wasn't looking at him. "I'm not running away. I'm trying to be honest about what I need. Don't follow me." And then she was gone. Not with the dramatic flair of her potion self, and not with the desperate flight of a wounded animal. She walked out like a woman making a decision that cost her something. Felix could see it in the stiffness of her shoulders, the way she didn't look back. She wanted to look back. She didn't. Felix stood alone in the library, the silence roaring in his ears. He had done it. He had cured her. And she had walked away with her eyes open. "This is a critical failure," his wolf stated, and for the first time, the monotone was laced with something that sounded like pain. "The emotional structure has collapsed. Contingency plans have failed. We are alone." He shifted in the library, right there on the rug where he'd lain while she read to him, and the wolf hit the ground running. He went through the postern gate and into the rain, into the forest, and he ran the perimeter trail until his legs burned and his lungs ached, and the rain had soaked through his fur to the skin. The sentries didn't flatten their ears this time. They whined, low and uncertain, recognizing grief. He ran until the trail became mud, and the mud became a stream, and the stream became a river, and he stood in it, chest deep, the cold water pulling at his fur, and he howled. Once. The sound carried through the wet forest, and the pack heard it. No one came. No one was supposed to. A wolf howls alone when something has been lost. The pack knows to let the sound travel. Marcus found him 2 hours later, still standing by the window, watching the rain. "She left," Marcus said quietly. Lena went with her. The cottage is about a half-hour's ride outside the village, past the old mill. Felix felt a cold emptiness spread through his chest. He had faced down traitors, negotiated with hostile pacts, and managed a kingdom on the brink of chaos. But the thought of Clara, alone in a borrowed cottage, trying to sort real feeling from magical residue, that was a pain he had no defense against. She had told him not to follow. She had been clear. She needed space. He lasted 3 days. On the third morning, he came downstairs to find a small package on his desk, delivered by Lena the night before. Inside was a single loaf of bread, a perfect golden brioche, and a folded note. I made this without thinking about you at all. I was thinking about hydration percentages and oven temperature and whether Lena's parents' kitchen runs hot. And then it was done, and it was good, and I realized I wanted you to have it. Not because of a potion, because I know you skip meals when you're stressed, and Marcus says you've been skipping meals. This is a choice, not a compulsion. I want you to know the difference. Clara. He stared at the note for a long time. Then he looked at the bread, the perfect golden crust, the careful, deliberate craft of it. A baker's language. Not a sonnet, not a declaration, just, I made this for you, and I know why. Marcus, he said, his voice raw but determined. Saddle my horse. Marcus Thorne, for the first time in his long, exhausting service, smiled. I was wondering when you'd ask. The cottage was small and unassuming, nestled at the edge of the woods with a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. It smelled of rain-soaked earth and baking bread. Felix dismounted, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He was wearing simple leather riding gear, no crown, no royal insignia. He was just a man who had eaten the best brioche of his life that morning and couldn't stop thinking about the woman who had made it. He knocked on the rough wooden door. It opened a crack, and Lena's wary face appeared. She said, "Don't follow." She also sent bread, he said. Lena studied him for a long moment. Something in his face must have satisfied her, because she sighed and opened the door wider. Don't make me regret this. Clara was standing by a large wooden table, her hands covered in flour. A half-kneaded lump of dough sat in front of her. She was wearing a simple apron over a plain dress, her hair tied back in a messy knot. She looked more beautiful than he had ever seen her. She was looking directly at him, and her expression was not surprised. It was the look of someone who had been expecting a knock and wasn't sure if she was relieved or terrified that it had come. I told you not to follow me, she said. You also sent me bread, he said, taking a tentative step into the warm, fragrant room. With a note, a very specific, very deliberate note about hydration percentages and choice. It was just bread. It was not just bread, and you know it. A silence. She punched the dough once, hard, and didn't look away from him. So what if it wasn't? He walked closer until he was standing on the other side of the table. You said you couldn't tell what was real while you were standing close to me. It's been 3 days. You're not standing close to me anymore. What did you figure out? The question hung in the air. Clara's hands went still on the dough. She looked down at them, then back up at him, and he saw the cost of what she was about to say written all over her face. Her jaw was tight, her eyes were bright. She was terrified. I figured out, she said slowly, that the cottage is quiet, and there's no potion, and there's no you. And I still think about the way you said placeholder, like it was a secret you'd never told anyone. I think about how you straighten the tapestries when you're worried. I think about how you laughed when I defended the goose. And none of that is magic, I checked, repeatedly. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving flour streaks. I also figured out that I am an orphaned Omega baker with flour in her hair and a public track record of writing terrible poetry. And you are the king, and this is insane. It is insane, he agreed, and his voice was not steady. Good, I'm glad we agree. She took a breath. Come here. He walked around the table. She met him halfway.
"I want to be clear," she said, and she put her hands on his chest, leaving 2 perfect flower handprints on his dark riding jacket. "I am choosing this. Not a potion, not a scaffold, not a magical compulsion. Me, Clara, choosing you, Felix. Fully aware that I once tried to knight a goose in your honor, and will have to live with that for the rest of my life." The goose had it coming, he said, and his voice was thick with something that was definitely not laughter. "It really didn't," she said, and then she kissed him. It wasn't a king's kiss or a soulmate's kiss. It was Clara kissing Felix. Deliberate and brave and slightly clumsy, because her hands were still covered in flour, and she had to go up on her toes and she was shaking. It was quiet and real, and it tasted faintly of flour and hope. It was perfect. 1 year later, King Felix Severin stood in the Great Hall, watching his wife, Queen Clara, in a heated debate with the royal architect. "No, you don't understand," Clara was saying, gesturing with a half-eaten scone. "The airflow from the kitchens is all wrong. The humidity is affecting the proofing boxes. We need a dedicated, climate-controlled royal bakery. It's a matter of national security. A kingdom cannot run on subpar brioche." The architect looked utterly bewildered. Marcus, standing beside Felix, sighed the sigh of a man who had accepted his fate. "She's terrifying. I love her." Lena, now officially his mate, patted his arm. "You get used to it." Felix just smiled. His life was chaos. Clara had instituted a mandatory cookie break during council meetings. She had befriended the glimmer mites, discovering they could be placated with tiny, shiny sugar beads, a solution born from the same methodical mind that had identified their attraction to polish in the first place, solving a century-old problem. She filled his life with laughter and flour and the kind of joy he never thought he'd be allowed to have. Later that day, he found her in their chambers, staring at a tapestry on the wall. It was the one depicting the pack's founding. It was hanging slightly crooked. "It's crooked," she said, frowning. "I know," Felix said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder. "Aren't you going to straighten it?" she asked, leaning back against him. He thought of the man he used to be, the one who needed every line to be perfect, every variable controlled. He thought of the beautiful, unpredictable chaos she had brought into his life. "No," he said, kissing the side of her head. "I think I like it better this way." From the depths of his mind, a familiar deadpan voice spoke. "The emotional structure is stable. The union is sound. Procedurally unorthodox, but effective. Final report, A+. Felix smiled. He wouldn't have it any other way. That night, at moonrise, the pack ran. Felix shifted at the postern gate, his dark wolf shaking itself loose with the easy grace of long practice. And Clara was there beside him, in riding boots and a cloak, because she was the queen, but she was not a wolf, and she had made her peace with that. She ran with them on foot for the first stretch, the flat meadow between the palace and the tree line, and the pack flowed around her like a river around a stone, and she laughed, breathless and bright, her cloak streaming behind her. At the tree line she stopped, and Felix's wolf circled back to her, pressing his broad head against her palm. She scratched behind his left ear. "The good one," she said, smiling. Then the pack was gone, a dark river of fur and muscle pouring into the pines, and Clara stood in the moonlit meadow and watched them disappear, flour still on her fingers from the evening's baking. She would be in the kitchen when they returned, warm bread waiting, and the wolves would pad in one by one, shifting back to human form with damp hair and bright eyes, and the palace would smell of pine and yeast and home.